You're listening to The Pivot, brought to you by Globally News, where we discuss the leaders, states, networks, ideologies and technologies that are reshaping the world order. Visit our website at globally.news. That's globe, L-Y, .news.
Hi everyone, welcome to The Pivot. My name is Arif Rafiq and I'm your host. Mexico made history earlier this month with the election of Claudia Sheinbaum as its first woman and first Jewish president. Sheinbaum, a climate scientist and former mayor of Mexico City, will have big shoes to fill. In October, she'll take the place of the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, also known as AMLO. AMLO is a charismatic populist leftist who leads the Morena party, which has transformed Mexican politics, eviscerating the established parties known by their acronyms PRI and PAN. AMLO likens his rise to a revolution, and in this episode we'll take a deep dive into AMLO's record and explore his heterodox anti-neoliberal politics and assess what the future holds for Morena and Mexico under the leadership of Claudia Sheinbaum. To discuss all this, we're joined by Juan David Rojas, an analyst and commentator on Latin American politics, and a columnist at Compact Magazine. Juan Rojas, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the podcast.
So Mexico has a new president-elect, Claudia Sheinbaum, and we're going to devote the latter half of this episode to her. But I think any discussion of Dr. Sheinbaum will center on AMLO, her mentor and the current president. And I want to make sure our listeners understand the type of mantle she's inheriting, because AMLO either directly or indirectly will have an influence over the Sheinbaum presidency. So talk to us about the context in which AMLO emerges in 2018. What kind of Mexico did he assume control of? And what was the mandate that he was voted into office for?
So Mexico, throughout the 20th century, from around 1920 till 2000, 1920-something, around 70-odd years, was basically a one-party dictatorship run by what is still called the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI. And it had various iterations, fascinating party, honestly, because in its early history, it was more nationalist and left-wing, and then over time transitioned into more centrist, amorphous, clientelist organization that just dominated the entire country for decades. Beginning in the 1980s, we saw, as in other countries in Latin America, the neoliberal turn. The PRI readily embraced this and engaged in campaigns of privatizations and deregulation, abandoning industrial policy. Between the 50s, the 70s, and especially in the 70s, Mexico was a really prosperous country off of the oil boom. Its state-run oil company, Pemex, was one of the top oil companies, still is in the world, except today it's heavily indebted. But you looked at per capita GDP, it was extremely high, real wages as well. You get to the 1980s, there was this horrible debt crisis, the Ultra shock in the US. They started massively raising interest rates. In Latin American countries, Mexico especially, had taken on a lot of dollar-denominated debt. This led to a horrible debt crisis, what was called the lost decade during the 1980s. In the 90s, policymakers figured that the way to get ahead was this turn to neoliberalism. Pemex, which had been such a successful company, had really started to turn into a cash cow, and they abandoned this industrial policy they had of kind of conditioning production on results and giving subsidies in conjunction with the firm's performance. You get to the 2000s and the PRI is defeated in the ballot boxes. There had been reforms that allowed for fairer democracies, fairer elections. For decades, elections had been rigged, most famously the 1988 election. And the conservative PAN, the Partido Acción Nacional, the National Action Party, took over. And so you had this alternation between 2000 and 2018 between the PAN and the PRI with democratic elections. There was also the left-wing PRD, which had been competing also with the two other parties, but never managed to actually win office. In 2014, AMLO, who had basically been the standard bearer of the PRD since 2000, he was mayor of Mexico City before the PRD between 2000 and 2006, ran for office in 2006 and 2012, lost both times. There were a lot of irregularities in 2006. And in 2014, he left the party, created his own political movement, Morena, Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, National Regeneration, which is catchy too, because in Mexico, people call La Morena the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is a kind of cultural icon, cultural and religious icon in the country. And he ran on this populist platform, as he had for the several years, on renegotiating NAFTA, which in some ways had been devastating for Mexico when the agreement was enacted in the 90s. But what happened was it led to this boom in manufacturing, of course, which also was helpful in the sense that the wages were extremely low. So a lot of manufacturing firms in the U.S. Had a deep incentive in moving their operations to Mexico. But at the same time, the flooding of U.S. subsidized agricultural goods into Mexico was devastating for small farmers, led to a mass exodus of Mexicans to the U.S. that were small farmers and simply could not compete with U.S. goods. Mexican immigration to the United States really started during this period, and AMLO had been a huge critic of NAFTA, as well as the Mexican immigration to the U.S. He called it a national disgrace that so many people were leaving the country. He essentially, campaigned in favor of the people, quote unquote. He has so many slogans. He's a great sloganeer. He's very similar to Trump in that sense. And because of the failings of the past administrations, he just won in a landslide in 2018, won every state but Guanajuato with around 55% of the vote, and has enjoyed extremely high approval ratings throughout his term. According to Morning Consult, he's essentially been the second most popular Democratic leader on the planet during the past 6 years.
Yeah, and part of that popularity stems from his kind of raging against the machine, right? He's put the country into two categories: the people and the elite, and much of that relies on leveraging and tapping into the frustration over the deep inequality in Mexico. Mexico is one of the world's most unequal countries. When AMLO came to power, roughly half of the population lived below the poverty line. And Mexico is a big economy. It's the world's 15th largest economy, and it's part of a very economically robust North American continent. It's also home to 22 billionaires or so. And the funny thing is, I've come across commentary that's been critical of AMLO in recent weeks surrounding the election. And often they didn't mention this inequality, which is quite striking. So talk to us about that inequality in Mexico and how that made 2018 AMLO's moment.
Yeah, by some measures, Mexico is the fourth most unequal country on the planet. The way you measure, the Gini coefficient, and there's a lot of variety in terms of these indexes, but Latin America is an extremely unequal region. But what we do see is that the most unequal countries are Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. But by no stretch of the imagination, it's very easy to say that Mexico could be the most unequal country in the region. And, AMLO, he has made because wages were so low for decades in the country, one of the staples of his administration has been raising the minimum wage by large increments, upwards of 20% every year. This is a very big deal because of the fact that since the 70s, policymakers took the deliberate decision to no longer raise the minimum wage. There's this great graph that I like to refer to, shows how the minimum wage fell in Mexico beginning in the 1970s and then stagnated from the 90s on. As I mentioned a moment ago, this makes a lot of sense considering that the country in a way benefited from low wages as a result of NAFTA and all the manufacturing it absorbed from the United States. You then see that since AMLO has come to power, the minimum wage has shot up in real terms by around 130%. This is a huge component to his popularity. At the same time, the benefits that we're seeing from NAFTA benefited mostly Mexico's north, its industrial north near the border where all the maquilas are that assemble these manufacturing goods to export to the U.S. The south, where he is from, incidentally, from the state of Tabasco, had really been left behind for many, many years. And so what he has done is promoted these huge mega projects in infrastructure. The Maya train, which itself has been controversial for environmental reasons. The Dos Bocas refinery, this huge oil refinery in his home state of Tabasco. And the one that I think is actually the most important, the trans-oceanic train, which is still under construction. It's this train that will be meant to help multinational firms bypass the Panama Canal, cross through the isthmus there, and allow companies to transport goods from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific.
So AMLO comes after this period of the 1980s in which Mexico and many other countries, after the fall of oil prices, were forced into structural adjustment programs, which had a pretty devastating effect, especially on the middle class and the poor. And then much of the population bore the negative brunt of the externalities of neoliberalism stemming from NAFTA. And so talk to us about the kind of characterization of neoliberalism in AMLO's discourse, because when I look at his speeches, the word neoliberalism or neoliberal is almost a curse word. And I've even seen some Twitter responses to Claudia Sheinbaum's tweets when she's had these post-election calls with the head of the IMF and others that seem to represent the neoliberal elite in the world. And some have called her neoliberal, but in a derisive way.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe these are just random trolls taking pot shots at her, but it shows that this is a negative word in the lexicon for many Mexicans. So I'm wondering, is that something that AMLO invented or something he tapped into, this frustration with neoliberalism and this role it plays in the political vocabulary in Mexico?
Yeah, he has all of these idiosyncrasies, and it's interesting because he refers to conservatives all the time, which for him, conservatives and neoliberals are essentially the same thing. But the interesting thing is that he himself is very traditionalist and espouses what to a lot of people are fairly conservative values. He quotes the Bible and refers to norms and to traditional Mexican values, stuff like that. He regards neoliberals and what he calls conservatives as upper class people. And it's interesting because we see in the United States, some of the discourse against neoliberalism now comes from the right, and it's mainly to refer to these, kind of the affluent professional managerial class. And, typically for conservatives in the U.S. and the economic argument isn't really included. It's more a moral and cultural argument of neoliberal progressive values and stuff like that. AMLO, for him, as I said, he views the elite, the mafia of power is another one of his slogans, as what has just devastated the Mexican working class and the poor.
Right. And it's interesting, NAFTA was very much hailed by the establishment right in the United States into late Obama, early Trump era. You had some people on the right here in the U.S. who railed against it, like Pat Buchanan, but they were really outliers within the Republican Party.
Exactly.
And now we see a convergence on the sort of maybe the extremes of the left and the right in this skepticism towards neoliberalism and its effects towards workers and what they regard as average Americans. I think there's a sort of a overlap between what's happening here and there. And then in Mexico, as you said, NAFTA has devastated local agriculture and then also has not really produced the kind of wage growth that one would associate with a more open economic and competitive economic environment. And so Mexico is seen as a call for low cost labor, but that was China's value added. That was China's advantage in the 1990s and early 2000s. But they've seen those massive productivity gains and wage growth that allows for the wage growth as well. And so while wages in China are, higher than that of countries like India and Vietnam, they have that productivity that allows them to continue to remain being this factory for the world. And we're not seeing those commensurate gains in Mexico, despite the overlap in terms of timelines, in terms of this embrace of global markets. And so it seems like, AMLO's tapping into a lot of that frustration. And you also talked about the heterodox nature of AMLO, that he's someone who invokes much of the kind of the standard fare leftist populist rhetoric, but then he also cites biblical scripture and themes. And there's a strong moral voice to his public speaking. And he's someone who's very fond of public speaking. He gives these presumably daily press conferences and has done this since he was mayor of Mexico City. And these are, 2-hour press conferences. And, I've read a translation of his speeches, and he speaks to morality and yet this concern for the poor. And so it's a unique combination that we don't quite see in many countries, I think, because
including in Latin America. Yeah.
Yeah. And so talk to us about that, because is that representative more so of AMLO, the individual, or Morena, the party and movement? Is he sort of unique in that respect, or is there a broader base that he's tapping into?
I'll step back a second in the sense that there are some leftists in Latin America that are fairly similar to López Obrador. One that comes to mind is Evo Morales in Bolivia. And some listeners maybe have seen on Twitter or in other places, Latin Americans like to put together these maps that categorize the different kinds of governments and each country. And some have termed AMLO, a kind of conservative leftist. And so the MAS, the ruling party in Bolivia, previously under Evo Morales, now under Luis Arce, is similar in the sense that they are more socially conservative, but are still very populist and left-wing on economic. Similarly, in Ecuador, that was likewise the case with Rafael Correa and, some of the leaders of his party. For instance, the candidate last year against Novoa, Luisa Gonzalez, who's actually a evangelical Christian, anti-abortion, but very left-wing. Protectionist and nationalist, and when it came to the economy. So AMLO kind of fits with that tradition, but we also see in Latin America, there are more conventionally progressive leftists. Gabriel Boric, is a champion of LGBT issues and stuff like that. Lula, even to an extent. And in Colombia as well, Gustavo Petro. At the same time, some of these left-wing parties and leaders are more in favor of extraction, minerals, oil, hydrocarbons, stuff like that. AMLO's a huge oil guy. This is similarly the case in Bolivia. You look at, in contrast, Colombia, Gustavo Petro has had a very antagonistic discourse against oil extraction and stuff like that, and has wanted to transition the country more in favor of tourism, etc. That said, AMLO is still very unique in the sense that he combines a number of other idiosyncratic positions that are unique to both Mexico but himself as well. He has an almost libertarian bent, what he calls, Republican austerity. It's from a populist posture in the sense that in Mexico, the state and the state bureaucracy was seen as just this hulking, bloated bureaucracy where, government servants were paid huge salaries. This is something that he railed against in the sense that Mexico is a poor country, and how can, you have such a rich government? This is another one of his slogans, in a poor country. One of the first things he did when he came into office was slash his own salary by 60% and massively downsize on a lot of state agencies. The Mexican Constitution says that no public worker can earn more than the president. And, he, and as you mentioned, his morning press conferences that are Monday through Friday, he loves to go on and on about this stuff, how austere he is and his government has been, and whenever he finds out that someone is being paid more than they should be, he likes to show in the mañaneras, reveal their salaries and rail against them. It's classic, masses versus the elites types of things. So there's a lot of layers to the guy that are interesting. Some would say cringeworthy, and other people love. But at heart, most Mexicans view the current president, the outgoing president, as someone not only who is looking out for their material interests, but also shares their values.
Right. And his popularity is quite high. It's somewhere around 60-70% right now, and has remained pretty much around that for most of his tenure. So why is that the case? Because AMLO's promised nothing short of a revolution in his term. He's described his era as the fourth transformation. And so he's putting his rise to power, his era, as one that's akin to Mexico's War of Independence from Spain and the early 20th century Mexican Revolution. So has there been a fourth transformation? How successful has AMLO been in these 6 years?
In political terms, you could definitely call what he's done a political revolution. His party, wow, in just under 10 years, has truly taken over the country. They control something like 3/4 of the governorships. They won 7 out of 9 governorships in the past elections. And now are poised to have almost 2/3 control in both chambers of Congress under Sheinbaum. You talk to ordinary Mexicans, especially the working class, street vendors, service workers, they'll tell you, this is the first president in my, and I quoted someone who said these same words, this is the first president in my lifetime who ever gave a damn about people. And the opinion you'll get from middle and upper class Mexicans, especially outside of Mexico, is very, very different. They'll refer to him as just this demagogue and a charlatan who's fooled the people and hasn't delivered on his promises. Sure enough, he, for instance, said that under his government, GDP growth would rise to 5%. That has not happened. It's been more between 1% and 2%. I think in cumulative terms, around 1.8% throughout the sexenio. This is 6-year term. He also, said that he would make gains in combating Mexico's drug cartels, specifically reduce violence. That really has not happened. And this is a whole other complicated issue. The government likes to tout that homicides have gone down by 10% during the president's term. The opposition likes to critique those numbers, and there's a lot that we can parse there. But on a basic level, most people view the country as still being extraordinarily dangerous, especially in specific states. And this is something where average Mexicans will tell you that, that's definitely the government's biggest failing. In gross terms, and this is slightly misleading in the sense that, according to the official figures, homicides have gone down. But in absolute terms, the current sexennial will be the most violent on record, in the sense that something like 170,000 people will have been killed in the past 6 years. On the other hand, as I said previously, wage growth really is the administration's primary achievement, and in addition to investing in more forgotten regions and all these mega infrastructure projects. Because they raised the minimum wage so much after decades of stagnation, it's had an interesting effect in that it's actually raised the living standards and wages of informal workers, which account for around half of the population. They also, in 2021, banned outsourcing and subcontracting of firms. This is something that's extremely common in the United States, for instance. I've referred to the example, there's a great paper I read on how I believe Marriott uses subcontracting of its janitors. That's to say that Marriott's janitors are not actually employees of the company Marriott itself. They are subcontracted by Marriott to a third company, and this way they can pay workers less and also avoid giving them benefits as well. This was done away with outright in 2021 in Mexico and has really redounded to the benefit of workers. Similarly, they've allowed They've made it easier for the creation of independent unions, which for decades were essentially pawns of the PRI. In macro terms, I've said that what AMLO has achieved in terms of the economy is quite remarkable. Why? Because GDP growth has been so low. In 2023, it rose to about 3.4%. And there's this whole nearshoring boom, which is a whole other issue that's kind of difficult to parse as well. But the decline from the pandemic was especially devastating in Mexico. I think the economy contracted around 6%. In 2021, it rose about 4%. Then in 2022, also 4%. 2023, 3%. In the aggregate, GDP growth has essentially remained stagnant relative to previous governments at around 1 to 2%. This is terrible in a developing country like Mexico. Yet at the same time, it's very impressive that the government has been able to show such remarkable results in terms of raising wages and also reducing poverty. It's estimated that more than 5 million people were lifted out of poverty in the past. In the first 4 years of AMLO's term, between 2018 and 2022, because the government has favored the use of universal programs, which previous governments favored means-tested, targeted programs meant for Mexico's poorest. Interestingly, that's actually led to extreme poverty rising slightly, even though poverty as a whole has gone down. And some progressives, interestingly, will critique this, that people that shouldn't be receiving these programs have received them.
Right. Yeah. There's been criticism of these untargeted direct cash transfers, which are another peg to his sort of anti-poverty campaigns, along with what is the largest minimum wage increase in 40 years. Welfare spending has been tripled over the course of his administration. And yet at the same time, he's maintained this austerity regime. And so there have been costs that money has largely been taken from, other services like healthcare, childcare, and education. And so it's been directed at a large segment of the population, but it's not that targeted. And so it's produced some gains in terms of the decline of overall poverty rates from 50% in 2018 to 43.5% in 2022. But as you noted, the extreme poor, that number has largely remained stagnant, if not increased. And so there's a question of whether this is the best approach, whether it's more political than economic, and whether it's sustainable. Because in the end, Mexican institutions, public institutions, and services could be decaying if this type of spending perpetuates under Claudia Sheinbaum. So that's definitely a critique. And then there are some claims that he's pursued this policy of developing national champions, which could be cronyism by another name. And Mexico has many, billionaires like Carlos Slim and others. And while he's gone after some very wealthy people who were associated with the preceding government of Nieto, we still have some others who have kind of been embraced by AMLO. So is he really engaged in structural transformation of poverty in Mexico? Or is this something that can only really last 1 or 2 election cycles?
Yeah, the reality, for instance, on the minimum wage is that there is a limit. And I've made this point that despite the fact that they raised the minimum wage by more than 130% in real terms, we have not seen a commensurate increase in unemployment or inflation, which is what a lot of market fundamentalist critics like to say will happen whenever the minimum wage is increased. The reality is that probably would eventually happen. It just hasn't happened yet in Mexico. Why? In 2018, inflation was around 4 to 5%. In 2022, it was also around 4 to 5%, despite the pandemic. Obviously, in total terms, I think in 2021, prices rose by about 7%. So prices today are much higher than they were before, but this is the case all over the world, and it's clearly due to the pandemic, not because they raised the minimum wage. Unemployment also is at a record, I think, like 30-year low, something like 2 point something percent. So that also clearly, raising the minimum wage clearly has not affected unemployment. Eventually, however, what we'll see is that if they continue raising the minimum wage, there will be a point, most likely, where we will see inflation start to go up, as well as unemployment as a result of raising the minimum wage. Most likely, I think that wouldn't happen for another 2 presidential terms, I think, because wages were so low. Relative to the 1970s, the current minimum wage is still around half of what it was then. As far as development is concerned, though, and you were referring to, it was funny. I wouldn't say so much that AMLO's managed to promote new national champions. He created a state lithium firm, which is still kind of in its infancy. And Pemex has serious problems. It's doing much better than during previous governments. But the company is around $100 billion in debt. It's the most indebted oil company in the world. And we can attribute this to a lot of the mismanagement from previous governments. But my main critique as to why Mexico, you referred to this before, has not seen the kind of development that China has. The country really is just an assembly colony. It has not been able to develop its own national champions in manufacturing. Essentially, all of these factories in northern Mexico are of foreign multinational firms. Mexicans simply assemble products from companies like Samsung, Stellantis, Chevrolet, etc. And the fact of the matter is, Mexican manufacturing is a bit of a misnomer. There are no high-value Mexican companies that produce cars, car components of any merit, really. So if we want to see further development, Mexico will need to follow the same path as China, Taiwan, Samsung, and move from mere product assembly into own brand manufacturing and develop companies like Samsung, TSMC, the like.
Right, and that involves some degree of innovation on the part of Mexican enterprises, and then also the development of the local human capital and talent to be able to spearhead all of that in terms of developing products and value chains and manufacturing. And so,
which is why also productivity has been so low. And one of the sad things about nearshoring, recently Robin Brooks has noted a lot of really confusing and bizarre data points with regards to the nearshoring narrative in Mexico. Mexico's trade deficit is extremely erratic. It goes from minor to moderate surpluses to then these huge deficits. And what we also see is that its trade deficit with China is enormous. A lot of goods that previously went directly to the U.S. now are circumvented through Mexico to avoid tariffs. There's similarly a lot of the investment that we're seeing from nearshoring is not so much companies that are opening up that are engaging in novel investment. They're more so reestablishing operations that they previously had prior to 2000 when China joined the WTO.
Right. And I've looked at the data on foreign direct investment in Mexico, and the composition actually hasn't really changed too much in recent years. So I think a lot of the talk about nearshoring may be to some extent hyped.
Exactly.
And it may be something that we may see a bit down the road, but then there are also potential challenges. Mexico's comparative advantage right now is one, the proximity to U.S. markets and the access through free trade, but then also the relatively low wages. And so if we continue to see this increase in the minimum wage, that advantage that Mexico offers to foreign entities may not really be there in the coming years. And so that's why the productivity thing is really essential, I think, in terms of getting that.
That's exactly right.
Right. And in terms of getting that balance between what's good for the worker and that sustainable FDI. And so at this point, Mexicans are being exploited for cheap labor. And that's been something that's been going on since the 19th century. I was reading Bad Mexicans, which is a book by Kelly Hernandez. And she talks about sort of the role of the Mexican diaspora or the Mexicans in the U.S. In the Mexican Revolution. But in the early part of the book, she talks about the roles Mexicans play in terms of labor in the U.S. in terms of building railroads and other types of labor in going back to the 19th century. And there's some crude statements by Americans, or white Americans, just talking about how Mexicans are essentially just sort of cheap labor to be used and all that. And so that goes back deep into time. AMLO taps into that frustration where free trade has given the established elite in Mexico a bigger piece of the pie, but the people that are impacted by it, the masses who are either devastated and have to migrate to the U.S. legally or illegally, or those who remain in Mexico and are paid comparatively, below market wages, are frustrated with all that. And so that structural transformation has to happen, not just through this kind of populist spending, but actual reform. And so on the question of reform, how would you evaluate AMLO's record? Because there's needs to reform the taxation system and other elements of the Mexican government. But it seems like he's kind of lagged on that, and maybe the focus has been on, empowering the state both as an economic vehicle and also in terms of arrogating power for the government through the use of referendum and maybe these future plans to have directly elected Supreme Court judges. So where do you think AMLO falls on that in terms of that balance?
Yeah, this is a good segue actually to a point you made before as to whether the social programs are sustainable. I think that they should. They're fine. The fiscal solvency of the social programs most likely are not in question. Why? You'll see a lot of financial outlets criticize the current government for this pretty big deficit, budget deficit that they have this year of around 5%, which is much higher than in previous years. The thing is, prior to 20, this is a cynical move as well. It was clearly meant for the election. Just a lot of election spending went over voters, which probably wasn't even necessary. But they also did this now because they had been so frugal in the years prior to 2024. AMLO was extremely criticized, including by outlets like Bloomberg, for not spending enough during the pandemic. Mexico spent around less than half in 2020 in government spending than countries like Brazil. And, let's not even talk about many first world countries that ran up deficits of around 10%. In the aggregate, Mexico's budget deficit during the past 3 years has been of around 3%. So most likely in 2025, we'll see some belt tightening, but I don't really see a case for things to spiral out of control, barring some unforeseen event, some kind of huge depression or something of the sort. As far as reforms are concerned, currently there's all this panic in the markets as to whether AMLO and Morena, Sheinbaum as well, will reform the judicial system in order to directly elect judges. That's actually a point that I do not view. I'm kind of indifferent towards it. I don't know. I don't actually think it's the worst thing in the world. Especially us living here in the U.S., Supreme Court justices are, in my opinion, inherently political positions. And if this reform goes through, it wouldn't just mean that the party would stack the court with its cronies. Voters would elect judges with qualifications to be in those positions. And importantly as well, they would be term limited. I think that's also a key aspect of the reform. Most likely, I think we'll see that reform watered down to some extent, mostly because the party does care to an extent about what markets think. Elsewhere, Remind me of some of the other points you made regarding some of the reforms the government's tried to push through.
Taxation, or has it pushed through
Taxation. That's another interesting point. AMLO has refused to raise taxes. And despite the fact that Mexico's upper classes hate his guts, the country's billionaires have seen their net worth, I think, double during the past 6 years. The fact that he hasn't raised taxes is another thing that markets like. On the other hand,
and why is that the case? And why hasn't he? Because he's called a leftist, and one would assume that is sort of standard fare leftism to increase taxes, especially on the rich. But he hasn't done that. Why is that the case?
That's right. Yeah, I would say most likely it's to try to tame investor fears over because he's done some fairly radical things. For instance, I believe it was with the transoceanic train. He nationalized a property or a property, some sort of the factory of Mexico's second richest person, Germán Larrea. And it was because they needed to build there, and so he wanted to get that done. And whenever he does stuff like this, it's not an isolated thing. This really ticks off investors. So I think it's kind of his way to kind of calm markets and show them, hey, look, I haven't raised taxes.
So he's picking his battles.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, he's really big on waste and trying to avoid waste. So he's tried to make up tax revenue by other means, not by raising taxes, but by going after tax evasion. Historically, Mexico's elite, its largest firms and its billionaires had engaged in rampant tax evasion under previous governments. And he appointed this really tenacious technocrat, Raquel Buenrostro, to head the equivalent of Mexico's IRS, the SAT. She later went on to become the current economy minister. This is a really, really, a competent government official who's engaged in what the Financial Times is called fiscal terrorism, in that they've managed to get all these big firms and billionaires to pay up millions, sometimes billions of dollars in unpaid taxes from decades ago. This is something that's still in the news. Mexico's third richest person, Ricardo Salinas Pliego, owes something like $3 billion to the Mexican state. He says it's all illegitimate and they're trying to extort him. And so AMLO has gone with him back and forth in his daily press conferences. He actually declared one of his golf courses an environmental preserve. And so Salinas said that he would just go and golf in Spain, one of his golf courses over there. And Salinas is a huge critic of AMLO, is a rabid libertarian, is really into crypto, and has a huge following on Twitter, actually, constantly attacking AMLO over his security record. So on that front, and very impressively as well, tax collection has gone up something like 100%, and tax collection from Mexico's highest earners has gone up around 61%.
So that's really interesting. So instead of increasing tax rates, he's gone after those who are avoiding taxes or evading taxes, and sort of careful dance he has to do with foreign markets, right? So foreign investors are afraid of unpredictability or erratic taxation. They don't want their investments to, let's say, be taxed at 15% one year and then 40% the next year to fill budgetary gaps. And so
exactly. And excluding 2024, as I said, in cumulative terms, he's kept very low budget deficits. That has in turn translated to Mexico's debt to GDP ratio is staying pretty stable at a respectable 50%. That's much better than a lot of Latin American countries, actually.
Yeah. And it speaks to AMLO not just being talented in terms of speaking to the Mexican masses, but pursuing his in many ways radical agenda, and not in a negative sense, but an agenda that is ambitious and radical in some ways, and transgressive in terms of countering these neoliberal norms, and yet not instilling fear in the foreign investor community, because we've seen FDI actually increase under his
Yeah.
tenure. So there's
Yeah.
been a lot of talk about how AMLO may be bad for business and so on and so forth. But and the opposition says that FDI could be much higher if they ruled. But we've seen a pretty healthy increase in FDI over the course of AMLO's tenure. And so, foreign investors aren't shying away. I'm not sure if they're entirely as enthusiastic as they would be under previous regimes, but not all FDI is equal. And so there's some FDI that may contribute to, let's say, overall macroeconomic health in that country in terms of balance of payments and all that, but they're not producing that kind of structural change in the economy that can improve the lives of Mexicans. And I think, AMLO's motto has been for the good of all versus the poor. And so in many ways, he's walked the walk. And it's a single term, but it's 6 years. It's a long time. Not in sort of monarchical terms, but in terms of Republican terms, it's a long time.
I'll say two things on that, actually, two interesting data points.
Yeah.
One, this is less data oriented, I guess, but I'm sure that investors would be happier if the opposition had been in charge these past 6 years. That said, what the opposition says all the time is that, the nearshoring boom has happened despite AMLO, not because of him. This is counterintuitive. Obviously, if he had engaged in the sort of spending seen in Argentina or just mismanagement of Venezuela, we would not be seeing the levels of investment and construction in industrial parks in Mexico's north. Similarly, on going back to the point on wages, and poverty, my calculations, according to 2017, the PPP dollars shows that real wages in Mexico have gone up something like 35% from 2018 to 2023. And that actually doesn't even include the 20% increase in the minimum wage in 2024. Similarly, the decline in poverty has to do with is recorded in tandem with Mexico's census, which was conducted in 2022. So the period observed is between 2018 and 2022. It's very conceivable, in fact, likely, that even more people were lifted out of poverty in the past 2 years.
Right, yeah. So let's get to Claudia Sheinbaum, because we haven't discussed her and we've gotten through much of the show. So she's got big shoes to fill. And we know the rough outlines of her background. She's got an energy engineering degree, PhD. She was part of a committee that shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 on climate change for their work on climate change. She seems to be more of a technocrat than a populist. What kind of leader is Claudia Sheinbaum, and what sort of standing does she have in Morena? Why did AMLO choose her?
So I've said this so many times, we really won't know how she will govern until she becomes president. What I'm looking at right now is who she keeps from the current administration. Specifically, I would love if she keeps the current economy minister, Juan. But I believe she said that she would retain the current foreign minister, Bárcenas, who is seen as extremely competent. That said, and as you alluded to, she is a very different figure from the outgoing president. She's seen as a technocrat, not very charismatic. She is far less combative than she is, and is much more willing to engage in good faith discussions with IMF. I hadn't seen what you mentioned, though, of critiques against her of being a neoliberal, but who knows?
I think it was just some random Twitter trolls. There are a lot of insufferable people there.
Possibly. But she has made, she basically ran, her platform was, I will continue, my the AMLO's work, and it just stood as close to him as possible. The only real difference was that she wants to prioritize an energy transition, which the current government has promoted some initiatives. For instance, is a large field of solar panels in the state of Sonora. But in macro terms, the results of the energy transition thus far have not been promising. She most likely will prioritize that issue. She said that she wants it to be a state-led approach, wants Pemex to transition towards exploiting lithium production, which is a tall order, and that debt needs to be refinanced, etc. Similarly, she's much more conventionally progressive than he is. As mayor of Mexico City, she was a champion of LGBT causes, and she was seen as leading a very successful administration, and touts that she reduced homicides by around 50%, provided over a number of good infrastructure projects, expanding the metro. Though there was a horrible accident in 2022, I believe. She was selected, I think, because López Obrador really seems, she has been by his side for decades. She was his environment minister when he was mayor of Mexico City between 2000 and 2006. And they had known each other, I think, since at least the early 90s. She had been part of the youth movement of the PRD, and left the PRD with AMLO in 2014, was one of Morena's founding members. Going back to a question you posed earlier as to whether the party is as heterodox as AMLO is, it is in a way, though this isn't necessarily good. Because the party has become so dominant, there are a number of opportunists, both within Morena and its allies, the Green Party and not so much the PT, the Workers' Party, but the Green Party is essentially just a facade for members of the PRI to align themselves with the current government. Almost all of the members of the candidates for the Green Party in this past election came from the PRI. And even with Morena, most of its governors also come from the PRI. Now, of course, almost every politician within the country at some point was associated with the PRI, but we've had a few decades now of post-one-party rule. There is more of a nationalist wing of the party, and you talk to a lot of voters, and there are ones that are much more concerned with, defending Mexico's state companies, Pemex and CFE, and others that are more progressive, more inclined towards concerns over the environment, climate change, social causes. But the interesting thing also, and I think this is good, you see that within the opposition as well. There are progressives and conservatives within the opposition. Similarly, there are a lot of voters and members within Morena that espouse more traditionalist and conservative views. They're big tent movements.
Right. And in terms of Sheinbaum's record, it's a bit mixed in terms of as mayor of Mexico City. Her handling of the subway was criticized. Some say she reduced expenditures on managing the subway and upkeeping it, and that contributed to some of the accidents. At the same time, she's lauded for advancing the digitalization of public services in the city.
Right. And that's something that she says she wants to scale up at a national level, actually, to increase tax revenues. We'll see how successful
Yeah.
she'll be.
And what's interesting about that is that she did that by building the internal capacity, engineering capacity of the city government, of the city administration. This came at a time where the inclination of many governments was simply to outsource these types of services. And I think that points towards both she and AMLO share this kind of state-centric approach towards the economy and governance. And so rather than handing this to Deloitte or McKinsey or someone, she's building the state capacity. And that actually resulted in tremendous cost savings. And so we have a leftist government that is not profligate with spending. And so I think that's pretty key. So there's a lot of criticism in terms of the amount of money that's been spent to keep Pemex afloat, which is a state oil company. But at the same time, as you'd noted, the budget deficits have not surged. And so there is, to some degree, some fiscal prudence. There's criticism of a whole bunch of other AMLO's programs, including the Maya train and a lot of these sort of projects that were pushed forward without the requisite due diligence. But at the same time, this is really a party that fits into a category of its own. And then AMLO within that Morena framework is sort of very unique on its own as well. And Claudia Sheinbaum has a very unique background. She's obviously the first woman president of Mexico, beat the U.S. in terms of that. She's also of Jewish heritage, definitely beat the U.S. in terms of that first. So that's a very important first. Might not necessarily be a big part of her public profile, but it's still significant in terms of religious minorities in our hemisphere. AMLO's a very compelling figure, and she may be as well. She may be someone who may not have that same charisma and attract that same attention, but I think a lot of people will be looking out for how she chooses to lead this very pivotal country in North America. And so on that question of leadership, do you think she has, the sort of the capacity to lead this now very powerful party, which is a movement that is to some extent composed of these disparate parts? And what will she do with all this power? She has a supermajority in the House and then close to one in the Senate. And
3 seats short in the Senate. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so does she have the ability to really lead a party like this and fill the shoes of AMLO? And under her tenure, will we see Morena grow or will it, maybe become the PRI 2.0? Or is this a party that maybe has peaked?
It's hard to say. As far as her leadership, at one point to her benefit, she is very technical. And one thing that a lot of voters I spoke with while I was in Mexico told me, that they viewed her as not very charismatic, a bit stiff, but they were impressed by how capable she was at giving detailed answers to complicated questions. And towards the end of the campaign, she did start to come into her own a bit, going on a lot of these news programs with very adversarial hosts and holding her own at being very strident and managing to impress a lot of Morena supporters. Whether she'll be able to keep the party together, and this is another question as to what exactly AMLO's influence will be in her government. Also very hard to say. He has said that he intends to retire from politics to his ranch in Chiapas, in Palenque, but has also said that he would attend a call from the president-elect should she ask for him. Who knows? There's a sweet spot where maybe he could provide operational support within the party, make sure that they stay in line. Alternatively, there are fears that he'll be the one calling the shots behind the scenes. That's what the opposition says. And there's a current list of around 20 reforms that he proposed in the beginning of the year. They were previously seen as unrealistic campaign pledges, but now have really rattled investors because of the fact that the party won such huge majorities. They could even conceivably win over those 3 votes. In September, the next legislature actually will be installed 1 month before Sheinbaum takes office. And so this just has the opposition and a lot of financial outlets really disturbed that AMLO will have this just incredible amount of power to be able to pass many of these reforms very likely before he leaves office. Yesterday, both him and Sheinbaum met in the National Palace, and she gave a press conference from where he gives his daily conferences as well. Said that she intends to pursue the judicial reform as well as the list of other amendments proposed by the current government. She said that she wants to, engage in a dialogue with different sectors of Mexico, including the judges themselves, Mexico's lawyers and the people. We'll have to see. We'll have to see exactly what comes out of those discussions. It's really just a kind of fortune telling game of everyone trying to put out their best guess as to exactly what will happen in the coming months or when she takes office.
Right. And those guesses have really been contradictory. So some people have said she's actually will be more ideological than AMLO. And then
Yeah,
others,
I've seen that as well.
yeah. And then others have said, no, she has this pragmatic streak, and she will sort of, tilt a bit more closer toward a more free market system or pro foreign investment and all that. So I think everyone's guess is sort of, has equal value. You get what you pay for.
Actually, an interesting point you brought up or alluded to, AMLO and a lot of the Mexican left is extremely critical of foreign NGOs, and I say foreign NGOs, but really you could say NGOs in general. It's interesting because in the U.S. you mostly see these sorts of critiques from the right that are critical of NGOs with regards to immigration and what they view as woke programs. And the Mexican left doesn't like them, one, because most of them are foreign and view them with suspicion as just kind of agents of Washington, etc. But on the other hand, because they favor these sorts of universal programs, AMLO was one of the things that he says is that he's interested in cutting out the middleman. No, we don't want to have to negotiate between these intermediaries that will administer X or Y program. We want to do it directly.
Yeah, and it's a big business.
Uh-huh.
So if you look at how U.S. aid is distributed, it's done through these intermediaries.
Exactly.
Have budgets of hundreds of millions of dollars, which are all from public funding. And then you have these individuals who earn six-figure salaries who are consultants in some of the world's poorest countries. And much of that aid money is lost to these intermediaries. And so, I think it's good that AMLO wants to own these projects, these social sector projects fully. And, any sort of public sector spending is political by nature. And I think there are definite critiques that are credible in terms of the means of doing so. But what I don't see is a lot of his detractors recognizing the fact that a lot of these public sector employees as well in Mexico are comparatively overpaid.
Yeah.
And so some of these salaries were very similar to, or if not higher than that of comparable officials in the United States. And given the wealth disparity on a per capita basis between Mexico and the United States, that's ludicrous. And so it justifies this kind of cost-cutting approach by AMLO, where more of the funding is directed towards the people as opposed to these intermediaries, whether they're foreign NGOs or bureaucrats they're overpaid. And there are obvious direct political benefits from that, but there is a non-political justification as well in pure efficiency terms. And so, and we'll get into how Mexico is discussed in a bit. But before we do that, I want to ask you, how do you think Sheinbaum will deal with the United States? Because when we look at the AMLO-Trump relationship, that was sort of night and day before he was elected and once he came to power. And so, I read this translation of his Oye Trump, this compendium of speeches that he gave, which were largely against Trump. And many of them were actually delivered to the Mexican diaspora in the United States. And these are, and I encourage our listeners to read them because the way AMLO spoke to his audience, he didn't demonize Americans. As we noted, there's a lot of, references to the Bible. There's a lot of moralistic language. There's a lot of references to not just to Mexican politics and Mexican history, but also to global events, including, the rise of fascism in Germany and the Holocaust, and sort of comparing Trump to Hitler. But then he's also he called on, and I'll quote him directly here. He told us, Mexican Americans, we must focus our attention on linking up with good-willed Americans, of whom there are many, who are victims of this manipulation and deceit. We must focus on those in small cities and towns, those with strong civic, moral, and spiritual values that are being poisoned by hate for migrant workers. And so he didn't appeal to the lower bases of people. He said, reach out to those who may be like us in terms of, we're the losers in terms of this neoliberal system. and let's find some common ground. And I thought that was phenomenal. He could have chosen a different path, but he chose one that was more responsible, more ethical. And yet, he was very critical of Trump before his candidacy.
Uh-huh.
And then
But
he
then
sort
while
of
he became president, a lot of that really
he
kind of
learned to love him or deal with him. So talk to us about that, and then how Sheinbaum might fare if Trump comes back to power.
There's a lot to say here. So I think that book came out in 2017, 2016. And so, AMLO ran for president in 2018. The election was in June of 2018, and he became president in December of 2018. I would venture to say that Trump most likely did not realize until he became president that most of the people going to the U.S. illegally were not Mexican. So, he has this famous quote where, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best, blah, 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 blah. And that, that for years that had been a stereotype in the U.S. that, Mexicans are the illegals that are crossing the border, et cetera. And there's still some of that, of course. But since the 2010s, Mexican emigration to the United States has fallen to historic lows. So much so that, during the 90s and the 2000s, Mexicans accounted for something like 3/4 of the people coming to the U.S. illegally. And since the 2010s, it's more like a quarter. The vast majority are from Central American countries, and in recent years, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and a host of other countries from all around Latin America and the world. So, but when Trump took over, that was similarly the case. Most of the people entering the U.S. at that point were not Mexican; they were Central American. AMLO, on the other hand, I think when both Trump and AMLO supposedly first met while before he had been inaugurated during the transition period, because in his capacity as president-elect, he was party to the negotiations to renegotiate NAFTA, which both he and Trump had been decades-long critics of and transformed into the USMCA. One of Peña Nieto's, AMLO's predecessors, said that from the moment they met, he said that Trump saw in AMLO, it was like he was looking at a mirror and called him Juan Trump. And despite what you said from his book, and AMLO's written like 20 books, something like that, you can kind of see it. Why? Even beyond a personal, superficial level, both him and Trump share a lot of key policy differences. They're both protectionists. They both were, as I said, hated NAFTA. They both despise the media. They're both fairly anti-interventionists in terms of foreign policy. They're both transactional figures. They both are pro-oil guys. And are obviously, kind of elites versus the masses populists. I think that when Obrador met Trump, he realized that actually this was someone that he could really get along with, and both of them could really see to each other's interests. A lot of analysts have noted that they most likely came to an informal agreement where the U.S. would agree to respect Mexico's security, energy policies, and minimally interfere in domestic affairs. And in return, Mexico would engage in substantial border enforcement along its southern border with Guatemala. And, Trump likes to talk about all this, talk about this all the time, that after AMLO created in 2019 the National Guard, which replaced the federales, the federal police, they came to an agreement where AMLO dispatched however many thousands of troops from the National Guard to the border with Guatemala to repel migrants. For his part, AMLO says that Trump acquiesced to a number of key demands for the USMCA, specifically on energy. And he's had this policy during his government of essentially renationalizing Mexico's energy sector because EPN the previous government privatized Mexican energy, allowing for foreign companies to enter the sector and compete with Pemex. This actually devastated Pemex and led to a huge decline in oil production, but that's something that we could get into. As far as Sheinbaum's concerned, she said that she's willing to, she wants to maintain good relations with Washington regardless of who wins in November, and has promised to acquiesce to Washington's migratory goals, whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration. This is only one thing that, and I mentioned this repeatedly, but it's a good sign of pragmatism. I hope we'll see more. One of the members of her transition team, Ramon de la Fuente, who's seen as a likely minister in her future government, openly criticized the Biden administration's asylum policy, called it a huge impediment to deterring border crossings. Specifically, the fact that virtually anyone who comes to the U.S. right now can apply for asylum. So, who knows? We'll have to see. I think that that's a good sign of pragmatism. Right now, the polls, I think, have Trump in the lead. He's definitely seen as the favorite, but who knows?
Yeah. And, as you had said, Trump deals well with individuals he sees himself in. And to a large extent, those are men. And so for Sheinbaum, there's an inherent disadvantage in that. But, both him and AMLO were also, very concerned about protecting what they regard as their national sovereignty.
Exactly. Yes.
And that is, in addition to the language about the poor and the moralistic language, the nationalist or patriotic language in terms of protecting Mexico's sovereignty is also very much part of the AMLO discourse.
Or the Trumpian discourse, you mean?
For the AMLO discourse, but then also for the Trumpian discourse. But, these are two different countries. It's Mexico's a developing country. The United States is a hegemon. Now maybe we have a multipolar system. Yeah. And so, the perceptions about the erosion of national sovereignty here, I think, are overstated. Everything's relative, but there still is that commonality. And so I think they learned how to kind of stay in each other's spaces. And that's pretty key for any foreign country that wants to manage Trump. You stay out of our business, we'll stay out of yours. Let's make a deal on whatever issues at hand. And that level of pragmatism is key to sort of managing the relationship with the United States, as long as bureaucrats in Washington don't get in the way. And in the Trump administration, they very much tried to do that, and in many instances had to do it because of various challenges that Trump posed to law and order here. Now, we're nearing the end of the discussion, and I just wanted to ask you, in terms of how Mexico is discussed in the U.S., what is the media here missing, and why? When I look at headlines, The Economist is a UK outlet.
But they had a really, really horrific piece that came out.
Yeah, Morena's landslide win threatens to take Mexico down a dangerous path. Then David Frum, everyone's favorite neocon from the early 2000s, writes in The Atlantic that Mexico is the failed state next door. He did, meet with the Sheinbaum and all that, and there were some legitimate criticisms, but then again, nobody wants to talk about inequality. No one wants to talk about this kind of rapacious elite and the failure of neoliberalism in Mexico. And so they painted with this one-sided picture where they look at the warts and the downsides of AMLO, but they don't look at the context in which he emerged and the problems he was trying to address, which is principally why I started this discussion that way, to sort of set that framing. So what do you think is missing in the U.S. discourse about Mexico, and why is that the case?
The discussion on Mexico really is dominated not just by the Mexican opposition, but by a certain class of Mexicans, mainly middle and upper class Mexicans, who obviously will not have benefited to the same degree as the Mexican working class, and will have a lot of personal and norm-related, critiques towards the outgoing president. Famously, an opposition journalist that I follow, he he posted something on the day of Sheinbaum's victory that he was in a line to vote in an upper class neighborhood of Mexico City, and the person next to him, that everyone expected her to win, but so the person next to him said that at least we won't have to listen to the mañaneras anymore. Those are the daily press conferences. So unfortunately, what we see, and even a lot of mainstream progressive outlets like Vox and The Guardian, they don't really talk to normal Mexican voters or members of the government frequently. You could read a lot of these articles where they'll consult almost exclusively the quote unquote experts, which are almost always favorable towards the opposition. And again, this is not to say that there aren't legitimate critiques of the current government. That said, we should have a holistic picture of the way things have transpired in the country in recent decades. I'll be honest, I am biased. I do happen to like Morena and its accomplishments during the current term. But I also think that that's a very valuable perspective to have in light of the fact that the coverage of the administration has been so skewed in a particular direction. Interestingly, often in the form of progressive critiques towards his administration, on the environment, climate change, and a lot of his quote unquote reactionary views.
And, what's interesting is I've found some of the more robust discussion of Mexican politics to be in Jacobin, which is a...
Kurt Hackbarth, who I met in Mexico City, actually. He's done some good work.
Yeah, and so it's a leftist outlet, very left. It's not just, sort of like The Nation. It's left of The Nation. And yet it's very detailed, very substantial, very structural in terms of its analysis. And your writing in Compact is also very excellent, which is why I brought you on.
Thank you.
And so, there's, I think with a lot of foreign countries, there is this kind of political economy of the discourse around them. And so a lot of these people are based in think tanks in Washington. There are people that fund the think tanks and they have vested interests. A lot of them tend to be, corporate entities or sort of the ultra rich who may be dual nationals or based abroad and have the ability to shift capital from point A to point B. And so, the person that represents, let's say, a street vendor or a factory worker in Mexico City, there's no one to represent him or her.
Exactly.
In Washington. And the general tendency of sort of Western news outlets is to quote an expert that's based in Washington about that country.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get that inherently skewed nature of reporting because the expertise is one that is done through a prism that is shaped by those funding dynamics and also by Washington's policy priorities. And in the end, to understand AMLO, you have to understand the Mexican people and the challenges that they face on a daily basis. Final question. What's your forecast of the road ahead? More specifically, what should we be on the lookout for this transition period over the next few months, and then during Sheinbaum's first few months as president?
Definitely, as I said before, I would be very, very interested to see who she keeps from the current administration, who she appoints to new positions with figures that are closer to her. Especially, for instance, in the state companies. CFE is currently run by Manuel Bartlett, who actually is a very shady figure, but he's done wonders at the head of the state electrical company CFE. It would be great if she kept him in. That would be a sign that, in my opinion, most likely that we will see a more measured approach towards an energy transition, as opposed to what, in my opinion, has been the more disastrous efforts of, Germany or, for instance, Colombia, that have just engaged in a lot of fanciful utopian thinking that has actually been counterproductive, and in many cases not actually led to less fossil fuel emissions. Germany famously closing its nuclear power plants and now is forced to burn more coal. genius stuff. But it explains a lot why the Greens were really hammered now in the recent European elections. As far as the political economy is concerned, one of Sheinbaum's closest advisors, Diana Alarcón, has said that the next administration views it as a priority to develop its own supply chains and national champions in manufacturing and stuff like that. That's just talk. We'll have to see exactly what they do. Sadly, in Latin America, that has just not been the case for the past decades. We'll also have to see whether the nearshoring, the narrative on nearshoring really turns out to be true. As we, discussed, the data is very mixed. There's a lot of construction of industrial parks and investment that has increased, but it's still a bit questionable the way we look at it. And some of the numbers also don't add up. I'd like to do a deep dive on that. I think that, and this actually would bring the discussion full circle to the kind of the overview I gave in the beginning. Mexico, thankfully, does have a pretty stable economy. Growth has been low, but very consistent. Since NAFTA, we've seen between 1% to 2% GDP growth. It's not good for a country like Mexico, but we also have not seen these really erratic downturns that have affected other countries in Latin America because, for instance, of the commodity cycle. Famously in 2014, there was this huge collapse in commodity prices, oil, and the like, that, led to the crisis in Venezuela, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, and a huge recession there. Similarly, in a lot of these other resource-based countries in South America. Mexico is interesting in that the initial shock from NAFTA to small agriculture, it led to around 1 million people being put out of work, most of which went to the United States. Over time, however, after that initial shock that it subsided by around the 2010s, the stability afforded by its manufacturing sector that grew during the 90s has been a key asset to the country, even if it hasn't led to broader development. What I'd like to say is that somehow everything always breaks even in Mexico. For instance, after 2000, China joined the WTO. This was devastating for manufacturing in Mexico. A lot of firms just picked up and left. They simply could not compete with Chinese manufacturing. And this led to something like 700,000 jobs being lost in the maquila sector after China joined the WTO. At the same time, during the 2000s, there was the commodities boom. And, Mexico is a big oil producing country. The peak in oil production was around 2004 at around 4 million barrels per day. You get to the 2010s, and then EPN decides to do this energy reform, opening up Mexico's energy market to private companies. The idea behind this was actually to increase oil production. The opposite happened. Oil production dropped from around 4 million barrels in 2004 to around 1.3 million in 2018. This was just completely devastating. So on the one hand, you had that, and all of these different intermoving parts, it leads to GDP growth being more or less stable, but low at around 1% to 2%. We'll have to see if something changes in the future that hopefully leads to better prospects for the country in macro terms.
And that was Juan Rojas of Compact Magazine. Please subscribe to our show on your platform of choice, and thank you for tuning in.